The storm ate New York in 40 minutes. Mara Voss watched it happen on 3 screens at once. Satellite feed, ground-level drone, and a shaky cell phone upload someone had managed to push through before the signal died. The cell phone one was the worst. You could see people running. You could see the moment they stopped. She turned away from the screens and looked at the object on the table in front of her. It was the size of a coffee thermos, matte gray, covered in cabling. She had soldered herself over the last 11 months in a detention room that smelled like industrial cleaner and teenage boredom. It had no name. She had never given it one, because naming things made you attached to them. And she'd had a feeling, all along, that this particular thing was going to cost her something she wasn't prepared to pay. She picked it up anyway. Voss. Colonel Tarrant appeared in the doorway of the converted high school gymnasium that FEMA had requisitioned as a command post. He was a large man who had learned, over 30 years of watching disasters eat cities, to make himself smaller than he was. He stood at the threshold like a man who understood doors. The second cell is forming over Philadelphia. I know. The particle count is still rising. I know that too. He looked at the object in her hands. Does it work? Mara thought about her mother's kitchen table. She thought about the night she'd figured out the X-boson resonance pattern. 3 a.m. Coffee going cold. Her mother asleep in the next room, and completely unaware that her 17-year-old daughter had just understood something that might kill them both. She thought about the way she'd sat there for a long time afterward, not writing it down, just sitting with it. I don't know, she said, which was true, and also not true, which was something she was getting better at living with. It had started officially 6 days ago. Unofficially, depending on who you asked. It had started 300 years ago, when Jupiter's great red spot first became a thing humans noticed and named and assumed was permanent. The spot was gone now. The astrophysicists had 17 competing theories about why, and none of them mattered anymore because the thing that had replaced it. A dense, structured, electrically charged atmospheric entity they were calling a propagation cell in official communications and a death storm in everything else, had already traveled 92 million miles and was currently making itself at home in Earth's upper atmosphere with the cheerful indifference of something that had never once been told it wasn't allowed. It was not alive. Mara was careful about that. She'd seen the models. She understood what it was, a self-sustaining electromagnetic weather system, seeded by a particle cascade, feeding on atmospheric moisture and electrical charge, growing more organized and more violent the longer it existed. It was not intelligent, it was not hostile, it was simply massive and hungry, and Earth was a buffet. But the propagation cells it threw off, the cyclones that spawned from its edges like children, those were something else. Those moved with a precision that bothered her. The first one had hit New York dead center. The second had rotated to Philadelphia with mathematical accuracy. The third, the model said, would hit somewhere in the Midwest. Somewhere with flat ground and low resistance and a lot of sky. Somewhere, in other words, like Hartfield, where Mara Voss had grown up, where her mother still lived. She'd called her mother 4 times since the evacuation orders went out. The lines were jammed. She'd gotten through once briefly and heard her mother's voice saying, "I'm fine, Mara, stop fussing," in that particular tone that meant she had absolutely no intention of leaving the house she'd lived in for 32 years just because some storm was coming. Mara had wanted to scream. Instead she'd said, "Okay, Mom," and hung up and gone back to soldering. The device was called, in her science fair documentation, which she'd been carrying in her backpack for reasons she couldn't entirely explain, a resonant particle attenuator. The name was technically accurate and completely insufficient. What it actually did, if it worked the way she thought it did, was capture X-bosons. X-bosons were the reason the storm was growing. They were subatomic particles that, under conditions of extreme atmospheric electrical charge, bonded to moisture molecules and created a feedback loop that made weather systems self-sustaining and accelerating. Under normal conditions, they were vanishingly rare. Under the propagation cell currently eating the eastern seaboard, they were abundant. Mara had been tracking them since she first noticed the anomaly in Jupiter's red spot 8 months ago, using a sensor array she'd built from salvaged radio equipment, a modified weather balloon kit, and 3 months of painstaking calibration that her science teacher had called ambitious, in the way that meant, "I don't understand what you're doing." The attenuator, if it worked, would create a resonance field that X-bosons would naturally collapse into, like a drain in a bathtub. Pull enough of them out of the local atmosphere and the feedback loop broke. The storm would lose its self-sustaining structure. It would still be a storm, but it would be a normal one. The kind that destroyed things at a reasonable human scale. The problem was she'd never tested it above a range of about 40 feet. The propagation cell was 400 miles wide. "Walk me through it again," said Colonel Taryn. They were sitting in a conference room that had been a school library a week ago. Someone had pushed the bookshelves against the walls, but hadn't bothered to remove the posters. "Reading is an adventure, and the universe is bigger than your problems," which Mara found either very funny or very unfunny depending on the moment. She set the attenuator on the table between them and a man named Dr. Gunter McGregor, who was the head of the government's Emergency Atmospheric Science Task Force, and who had been looking at her device with an expression she recognized as the one adults put on when they were trying to decide whether to be condescending or desperate. "The X-bosuns are the engine," she said. "The storm isn't generating them, but it's concentrating them. It's like, you know how a hurricane gains energy by pulling warm water off the ocean surface? Same principle, different fuel. The cell from Jupiter brought a high-density X-boson cascade with it. Earth's atmosphere has never encountered a particle density like this before. Our weather systems don't know how to dissipate it, so they're absorbing it instead. And that's what's turning ordinary cyclonic activity into something that can level a city in under an hour." "Your device," McGregor said carefully, "creates a resonant field tuned to the X-boson's collapse frequency. They fall into it the way electrons fall into lower energy states. Capture enough of them and the storm loses its fuel source. You built this for a science fair. I built it because I figured out something nobody else had, and I needed to know if I was right." She met his eyes. "I was right." McGregor looked at Taryn. Taryn looked at the table. Then he looked at Mara with the expression she was starting to think of as his real face. The one underneath the military discipline, the one that was just a person who was very tired and very afraid, and trying very hard not to show either. "The third cell forms in 8 hours," he said. "Trajectory puts landfall at approximately Hartfield," Mara said. "I know. I built the tracking model. My mom lives there." The silence that followed was the kind that meant everyone in the room was doing the math simultaneously and arriving at the same uncomfortable answer. "What do you need?" Taryn said. What she needed was a helicopter, 3 military-grade power cells, a signal relay array, and someone who could fly into the edge of a Category 6 cyclone without panicking. She got the helicopter and the power cells. The signal relay array she had to argue for, which took 45 minutes and left her feeling scraped hollow, in a way that combat footage of destroyed cities somehow hadn't. And the pilot was a warrant officer named Reyes who handed her a air sickness bag when she got in and said, with absolute neutrality, "Let me know if you need to use that." "I won't," Mara said. She used it 20 minutes later when they hit the outer wind bands of the forming third cell. Reyes said nothing. He just kept flying. The storm was visible long before they reached it. A wall of green-black cloud that rose from the horizon to somewhere above 30,000 feet. Lit internally by constant lightning that didn't flicker so much as pulse, like something breathing. She had seen the satellite feeds. She had seen the drone footage. She had not been prepared for the way it looked with her own eyes. The way scale worked differently in person. The way her body understood the wrongness of it, in a register that her brain couldn't quite reach. "Beautiful," she said, which she hadn't meant to say out loud. Reyes glanced at her. "Little bit," he agreed. The attenuator was connected now to all 3 power cells, and the signal relay array was mounted to the helicopter's external frame by a mechanism she'd improvised from cargo straps and the remains of a radio unit. It was not pretty. It would work, or it wouldn't. There was no in-between. She thought about her mother's kitchen table again. She thought about the way her mother made tea, the specific ritual of it, kettle on the left, 2 spoons of loose leaf, the white mug with the crack in the handle that she refused to throw away because it still held liquid, and that was all a mug needed to do. She thought about how she'd spent so many nights at that table, thinking about the stars, and her mother had never once told her to think about something more practical instead. Had just refilled the tea and asked questions she genuinely wanted the answers to. Mara pressed her thumb against the activation sequence. "Okay," she said. The attenuator lit up at 1433. The X-boson count in the immediate atmosphere dropped 17% in the first 90 seconds. She watched the numbers on her tablet and felt something cold move through her that was not quite fear and not quite hope. 40 feet, she'd tested it at. 40 feet with a particle density that was a fraction of what was moving through the air around them right now. The numbers kept dropping. "It's working," she said, and her voice came out wrong, too small, and she said it again louder. "It's working." Reyes didn't say anything. The helicopter shuddered as a wind gust hit them, 200 kilometers per hour at the edge of the forming cell, which was still just the appetizer, and he corrected smoothly, hands light on the controls, face completely still. "I need to get closer," Mara said. "How much closer?" "A lot." He looked at her, not a long look, 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then he turned back to his controls. "Okay," he said, that was it. No negotiation. "No, are you sure?" "Just okay," and then the nose of the helicopter dropped and they went forward into the green-black dark. The wind hit like a physical thing. The helicopter bucked and screamed, and Reyes flew it the way you'd hold something that was trying to escape. Not by force, by understanding, adjusting constantly, giving where he had to, and taking back where he could. Mara braced against the door and watched her numbers, and tried not to think about the fact that there was nothing between her and 4 miles of open air except a door she could feel vibrating against her shoulder. 23%, 31, 38. She needed 60%. That was her model's threshold for cascade interruption. 60% exposure and depletion in the storm's core region, and the feedback loop couldn't sustain itself. The storm would still exist. It would still be dangerous, but it would be a storm that could end, rather than one that could only grow. 44%. The lightning was constant now, sheeting horizontally across the viewport, and every strike lit up the interior of the helicopter in white, and she could see Reyes's face in those flashes, calm and ancient-looking the way pilots got, like they'd made peace with something most people never had to confront. 49. The power cells were running hot. She could feel it in the casing of the attenuator, the warmth traveling up through her palms. She'd built in a thermal cutoff as a safety measure. She hadn't tested what happened if she overrode it. She found the switch with her thumb and held it there, and did not press it yet. 53. The helicopter dropped 30 feet in a single second, and her stomach went somewhere else entirely, and Reyes pulled them back up without a word. 57. The device in her hands was getting hotter. The thermal cutoff was trying to trip. She was holding it back with one thumb, and it felt, absurdly, like that was the whole equation. One thumb between the storm and Hartfield, between now and her mother's kitchen table, between the world that existed this morning and whatever world came after. She pressed the override. The power cells surged. The attenuator went incandescent with readings she didn't have time to parse. The resonance field expanded outward in a pulse she couldn't see but could feel. A vibration in her teeth and sternum, like standing too close to a speaker system, like the earth itself exhaling. 61, 64, the lightning stopped. Not immediately, not all at once. It stuttered. 1 pulse, 2. A long pause, half a pulse, and then it was gone, and the green-black wall of cloud was still there, but something had changed in its quality, something she couldn't name but could see, the way you could see the moment a fire ran out of oxygen to burn. 67. The wind dropped from 200 kilometers per hour and 140 in the span of a minute, then 100, then 80, which was still enough to flip a truck but felt, after what had come before, almost manageable. "Mara," Reyes said. She looked at her tablet. The exposant count was in freefall. Not 60%, 91% depletion. The resonance field had gone further than she'd modeled, because she'd modeled conservatively, because she'd been afraid to trust herself, and the reality had outrun her fear. The third cell was dying. Not dissolved. It would take hours for the cloud mass to full up dissipate, and the weather would be ugly for days. But the self-sustaining engine was gone. It was just weather now. Difficult, expensive, exhausting, repairable weather. The kind Earth had been handling for 4.5 billion years. She sat back in her seat and realized her hands were shaking. Reyes flew them out of the dissipating storm and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Good." Just that, good. Mara looked out the window at the sky, which was doing something she hadn't seen in 6 days. Turning an ordinary late afternoon blue, the particular color of October over the Midwest, the color she associated with football fields and harvest, and her mother calling her in for dinner from wherever she'd wandered off to think. She picked up her phone, the signal was back. 4 bars clean, the strongest she'd seen all week. Her mother picked up on the second ring. Mara, not surprised, not relieved, just recognizing. The way you said someone's name when you'd known them since, before they knew any names at all. "Hey, Mom, are you all right?" "Yeah," Mara said, "I think so." "Good. Come home when you can. I'll make tea." Mara closed her eyes. The helicopter hummed around her. Steady now, the sky clearing. "Okay," she said. "I will." McGregor's people took the attenuator apart 3 days later in a facility she was technically not allowed to know the location of, and she let them, because the device had done what it needed to do and she'd already memorized every detail of it anyway. They would build better ones, bigger ones, ones that could operate autonomously from satellites, or from ground installations, or from aircraft that didn't have to fly into the edge of a world-ending storm, piloted by a man who'd just said okay and gone. She sat in on the briefing where they explained what had happened to the rest of the propagation cell. The parent system, the thing that had come from Jupiter. Without the X-boson cascade to sustain it, it had dissipated in the upper atmosphere over the course of 36 hours. There were still 2 weather cells over the Atlantic that would need monitoring. New York and Philadelphia were destroyed in ways that would take years to understand and decades to rebuild. The cost in lives was a number nobody was ready to say out loud yet. Mara listened to all of it and said the right things at the right moments and shook the right hands and accepted a commendation from Colonel Tarrant that she folded and put in her back pocket rather than her backpack, for reasons she didn't examine. Then she drove home. Her mother was in the kitchen when she arrived, not making tea. Not yet, that came later. But standing at the window looking out at the backyard, the way she did sometimes when she thought no one was watching. She heard Mara come in and turned, and looked at her daughter for a long moment with an expression Mara couldn't name. The way you couldn't name things that were too large for single words. "You're thin," her mother said. "I've been busy. I can see that." She filled the kettle. She put it on the left side of the stove. It was always the left side. It had always been the left side. There was no reason for it, except that it was how she did things and she'd never needed a reason. She took 2 spoons of loose leaf. She got the white mug with the crack in the handle. Mara sat down at the kitchen table. Outside the window, the sky was that same October blue, ordinary and enormous and present, in the way that ordinary things became when you'd recently stood in the dark and held back something that wanted to end everything. Her mother set the tea down in front of her. She sat across the table and wrapped both hands around her own mug and looked at her daughter with the direct, patient attention she had given everything her whole life. Bird-watching, crossword puzzles, the nightly news, the daughter who stayed up until 3 a.m., thinking about subatomic particles and didn't know yet that her mother was usually still awake in the next room, listening. "Tell me," her mother said. So Mara told her, all of it. The X-bosons, the attenuator, the helicopter, the override switch, the moment the lightning stopped. She told it the way she told everything to her mother. Completely, without performance. Without the versions she'd been giving to the generals and the scientists and the news crews. Just the facts in order and the feelings attached to the facts and the parts she still didn't understand. Her mother listened, didn't interrupt. When Mara was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "The override switch. Were you scared?" Mara thought about it honestly. "Yeah," she said. "I was." Her mother nodded, like this was exactly what she'd expected and exactly what she'd wanted to hear. "Good," she said. "You should be scared of things that matter." She took a sip of her tea. The scared part doesn't mean stop. 3 weeks later, Mara received a letter from the International Atmospheric Science Council, inviting her to join the task force developing permanent X-boson monitoring systems for Earth's upper atmosphere. It was addressed to Dr. Voss, which was not technically accurate, but which nobody seemed inclined to correct. She was also, separately, awarded a grade of B- on the original science fair project, on the grounds that her documentation was thorough, but her presentation lacked clarity. Her science teacher had written this before New York, and had not updated it. She framed that one too. Put it next to the commendation on the wall of what was going to become her first real lab. A converted room in a building that smelled like industrial cleaner, and afternoon light, and all the hours she'd spent figuring out things that nobody had figured out yet. The attenuator, or rather the first of 12 production models, now in various stages of development, sat in a climate-controlled case in a government facility somewhere. The thermos-sized original, the one she'd soldered in detention, the one she'd held her in her hands while the lightning sheeted through the air around her, the one that had gotten too hot and she'd told it to keep going anyway, that one she'd kept. It sat on her desk, no label, no display case. She'd had some idea of naming it eventually, but she kept not doing it. It felt important somehow to leave it nameless, to let it just be what it was. A thing she'd built because she understood something and hadn't been able to stop herself. Ray sent her a postcard 6 months later, just an image of a clear blue sky over somewhere tropical and On the back, in his neat, tight handwriting, "Still flying, weather permitting." She pinned it to the wall above the attenuator. On the nights when the work was hard, and there were many of those nights, because the work was always hard, because the things worth understanding were always hard, because that was the nature of problems that mattered. She'd look at it and think about the moment he'd turned to her in that storm-lit cockpit and said, "Okay, just okay, no hesitation, no negotiation, just a man who understood what was being asked and chose to help." She thought about her mother, awake in the next room all those years. She thought about what it meant that when the world needed saving, the mechanism had been a 17-year-old in detention, and a repurposed radio kit, and 11 months of stubbornness. She thought, that's us, that's what we do. We sit at the kitchen table at 3 a.m. and figure out things nobody's figured out yet, and then we get in the helicopter and we go. The sky outside her window was the same October blue it always was. Ordinary, permanent, present. She opened her notebook and started writing. The propagation cells never came back. Not from Jupiter. The absence of the great red spot left the planet's atmospheric dynamics permanently altered, and the particle cascade that had seeded Earth's crisis dissipated in the outer solar system with no mechanism to repeat. The Expos and Attenuator network, once deployed 12 ground stations, 3 orbital platforms, 1 airborne quick response unit based in Iceland, had no occasion to operate at full capacity for 11 years. In those 11 years, Mara Voss finished 3 degrees she'd technically already earned before getting them, built a research group that included people from 19 countries, and drank an amount of tea that her mother tracked in a notebook for reasons that were entirely her own. She also, in year 4, received a communication that wasn't from a university or a government or a grant committee. It came through channels she didn't know she had access to until it appeared in her inbox, flagged as high priority, marked with a code designation she had to look up. It was from a monitoring station in the outer solar system, Deep Space Array. The kind of installation built to track things at the edge of what instruments could detect. The message was short. It said, "We are seeing something at the heliopause we cannot explain. The particle signature is consistent with your published attenuator research. We think you should look at this." She looked at it for a long time. Then she called Reyes. He picked up on the second ring. "I know," he said. "I saw the same signal." "How? I've been watching since the first time." A pause. "What do you need?" Mara looked at the attenuator on her desk, the nameless thermos-sized thing. The thing that had gotten too hot and she'd told to keep going. "I need to build something bigger," she said. "Okay," he said, "just that." "Okay." She opened her notebook. She started writing. The sky outside was blue and permanent, and full of things that hadn't introduced themselves yet, and she was not afraid of them. Or not only afraid, which was the important part, which was the part her mother had given her at a kitchen table over 2 spoons of loose leaf, in a white mug, with a crack in the handle that still held liquid, and that was all it needed to do. The scared part doesn't mean stop. She wrote the first equation, she kept going.